Welcome to Life Talks. I'm Pastor Ben. I'm here with Pastor Dan. We are the pastors at Life Fellowship Church here in Cornelius. And Dan, 2021 has turned out to be just as crazy as 2020.
I want a refund. I was sold 2021 was going to be better than 2020.
We had all these podcasts like, here's how to make 2021 better. And then like the world just seems to be continually moving towards chaos. I mentioned this on a Sunday morning a few days ago that we would be recording some episodes on what transpired on January 6th, 2021. And I'll be honest with you, Dan, I hate talking about this stuff. I really do.
Yeah.
You know why? Because my personality is, I'm a 9 on the Enneagram. I don't want to have the hard conversations. I don't like negative, bad news. I would rather live in the Truman Show than deal with reality sometimes. And looking at what has transpired last week, it took me a few days to even read anything about it because I was just I just wanted to pretend in my own little world that it didn't really happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, this is stuff that requires some heavy-duty processing.
Yeah.
And I think it's almost dangerous to just go off the cuff on some of this stuff, which is why I'm glad, there's been almost a week has passed. Well, actually, 1 week ago today, while we were doing our last podcast, things were unfolding in the Capitol a week ago today. And I think also that it may be some time, it may be a time for us as a nation to catch our breath and do some thoughtful reflection that's not based on emotion. So much of the rhetoric and the heatedness of these moments are built on almost an insane level of rhetoric that at some point we can continue the path that we have and it's going to get worse, or some grown-ups in this country, whether in office or behind pulpits or in living rooms, are going to have to say, you know what, we all need to take a deep breath and calm down and regroup and then approach this not from an emotional perspective but from a truth-based perspective.
And that's so hard. I was reading an article by Kevin DeYoung. He had an article on the Gospel Coalition that I was reading this morning. And he talked about, it was, I think the title of the article is "Come Let Us Reason Together," which is a quote from Isaiah, God speaking to Isaiah. But he made an interesting comment that I thought was so profound in that he said, 2020, there's some very divisive, cataclysmic moments that transpired to divide our nation. And we talked about the fragmentation, but whether it was racial tensions, the COVID pandemic, or the presidential election, right? He said those three things have been major issues by which everyone, whether you're Christian, non-Christian, has been thinking and processing. And he said the problem between those three big moments in our history last year was not so much that we couldn't figure out how to move forward. We couldn't agree about what the facts were.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
No, and this is something that has been coming. It's been coming for 50, 60 years. And our institutions, and I did a series of podcasts when you were out on the decline and danger we are in because our major institutions have lost their credibility. But I think what we have seen in the last week just exacerbates, and to some extent it validates my argument, but exacerbates the situation, and that we fundamentally don't have a common point of truth anmore.
That's what's so hard.
You have your truth, I have my truth, and we don't trust the institutions to which we previously looked for to help us assign truth. So our religious institutions are largely viewed as corrupt or irrelevant. Our educational institutions are very much under the control of those under more left-leaning. The media, entertainment, politics, business. I mean, what you see going on in business right now, which is a whole-scale retaliation against conservatives, and that's right. I mean, even the most objective or subjective person has to admit that this is a rather one-sided response, not one that we don't that conservatives don't honestly deserve to some extent, but it has provided an excuse for an extreme.
Yeah.
And what has happened, I think, also because of social media, which is the new primary voice of where we go for our truth, is that everybody has, to some extent, a megaphone. And so we've got a pool of collective ignorance that is dominating the conversations from which we draw our opinions and ultimately our positions. So with that in mind, there are no clear definitions of truth. There are no things on which we throw out precedent, we throw out experts glibly because they simply disagree with our preconceived notions.
Right.
So all of this is creating just a pool of dangerous rhetoric and misinformation, and until we can pull back from those extremes and re-examine what is really real, what is really true, we're in trouble. Which is why I think as Christians we have an important responsibility not to get sucked up into this.
And that's the hard part, because I think we do. You talk about the pool of ignorance. I think it's a wave pool of ignorance. I mean, right now there's so much volatility. It just feels like it's everywhere. And so I think as a Christian, I wanted us to do two things. Number one, let's kind of process how should a Christian look at what happened on January 6th. Let's process that. And maybe that's all the time we have for this episode, but then maybe let's take another episode and talk about how do we move forward? How do we live as Jesus people, as people that have the Word of God and the King Jesus as our Savior? Like, what do we do? And I don't want to give the glib answers, but there is some things I think we need to be reminded of. But the reality is, the volatility, the uncertainty, it just feels like all those three things we talked about, whether it was the racial tensions, then COVID hit first, but then the racial tensions and the political just madness that's going on right now, it just feels like it feels like PTSD. Like everyone's just waiting for, like, when is this going to stop? What's going on?
Combine that with a complete breakdown of trust.
Yeah.
People who have been friends for years hate each other now.
Yeah.
Refuse to work with each other. Don't trust each other. And no relationship can exist apart from a foundation of trust.
Yeah.
And until we find a way to work our way back toward that, it's just going to be more of the same, I'm afraid.
All right, so let's kind of take January 6th, what we know, that there was a rally, right? And I don't know how many people were there. Some people say about 1 million. Some people say a few 100,000. I don't know. I wasn't there. I haven't even looked at all the pictures, but we know there are hundreds of thousands of people there, most likely. And there was a small group of them that went to the Capitol building at the request of Donald Trump, and some of them got violent, and it turned really ugly.
Yeah.
Right? Those are the facts of the situation.
Yeah, I may quibble a little bit with your use of the term small, because small can be a relative term.
Right.
There were sufficient enough that they basically overpowered the law enforcement officials who were there.
Right.
So we're not talking 20, we're talking hundreds, perhaps
yes.
a few thousand.
Yes.
So small compared to 1 million, but not small compared to if you have a police force of 200.
Exactly. What I'm saying is 99% of the people that were there that day did not participate in trying to overthrow. From what I'm reading, what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing, it was not, it was a very, very small fringe of the people that were there that attempted to do something. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
So you have this chaos that ensues, and then what do we make of this? What do we do with what has just transpired? Because I think even people that voted for Trump are looking at this in disgust, that this should have never happened. This is not whoever did this is not a reflection of people with conservative values or Republican Party or anybody else who voted for Trump. It's a very, very, very small percentage of people that believe that this kind of thing is appropriate. So what do we do with the facts of what transpired? How do we
Well, I think we need to be accountable for how we process it. And so much of what I've seen, and in disclosure, I've withdrawn from social media at this point because of the level of rhetoric. It was having a negative impact on me on several levels. But and again, you can't live in a complete bubble. But fundamentally, we need to be really, really careful about where we're receiving our information and accepting as true. And and consider the fact that all of us have confirmation bias. There are certain things we want to be true. So we need to be really careful about our own blind spots, I think, in this. And most of the people that are going to be listening to this are going to be conservative people.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, that's who we hang with, right? But one of the things that we tend to do is, to me, it is a wrong standard, but it is indicative of our current age, and that is what I call whataboutism. So many people have said, yeah, they went in there. Those that accept the fact, there's also those who are saying, oh, they were all Antifa people, they were plants and so forth. All you have to do is look at the actual video from the people who were holding their video phone or cameras up and phones up to know that this was not an Antifa battle. These people had histories, the QAnon, there were different types
Proud
of people
Boys,
there. And just some plain old extreme idiots that, people dressing up like buffalo and walking. I mean, these people are not attached to reality on some level. Right. But then the second wave of arguments that came out is, well, whataboutism? So the whataboutism is, well, what about the Seattle riots? What about Black Lives Matter? What about what happened in Kenosha? What about? And so we go, so in some way we then compare the conduct that we saw in Washington with others as an effort to say, well, if it was okay for them, then it must be okay for us. And if it's wrong for us, it had to be wrong. That's not the issue. Right. The standard for right and wrong is not other people's human conduct. And that is the danger of moral relativism, that we don't use a standard basis for. So under anybody's definition, going into places where you're prohibited by law needs to be wrong. Whether you're right or left, fascist or totalitarian, black or white, doesn't matter. There are some standards of conduct. The fact that everybody else is doing it, I think our mamas used to tell us, is not justification for us doing a wrong action.
Yes. And I think that's the biblical foundation for that, Romans 13, let us be subject to the governing authorities. Like, we understand that Christians should be the foremost examples of obeying laws that a government has. There are very small times when Christians shouldn't do that, but that's when man's laws try to undo God's law, which is a higher law. When Paul's writing that in Romans 13, he's saying, listen, you should be the best citizens you can possibly be. So we're not saying, make sure you're not viewing this through the lens of your political beliefs, but through your biblical convictions. Yeah. That's what we've got to do.
Yeah. And be willing to hold your words and your actions accountable to those truths, even if there's something in your core, something in your attitude, something in your personality that wants to go the other direction. And I think one of the values of Christianity that we've lost sight of, and by the way, the values of Christianity are not just for Christians. I mean, our entire nation has been filled with leaders and founders and so forth who were no more Christian than a man in the moon, but they embraced those values, the Judeo-Christian values. So there is a Christian value of moderation that we seem to be ignoring, and all the way through Scripture. In fact, the very passage of Scripture says, it is the love of Christ that constrains us. And what is that constraint? It's not doing as we could, but doing as we should.
That's right.
And so part of all of our responsibilities, whether we're posting something on Facebook or we're going to a protest, which we have a legal right to do, constitutional right to do, or whether we're just talking about somebody, casually about this, is that we should have a common awareness that not everything we can say should be said, not everything we can do should be done, that there needs to be this constraint, this moderation that keeps us from pushing the edges. And I think what we have done is we've given wholesale permission to ourselves to throw that standard of accountability, self-governance out the window. This nation was built on liberty, and liberty does not work apart from our commitment to self-governance. Because if you demand the government to govern you, then you're going to move toward totalitarianism. Yeah. And if you don't use some governance, you're going to go to anarchy. So there is a golden mean in the middle where it says, I will use an internal moral compass to determine how I'll behave, what I'll say, to what extent I would take up arms, and so forth. And for 250 plus years on this continent, it was the Judeo-Christian value of spiritual Christian moderation. Yeah. And our loss of that comes at great peril.
So what we're saying is, we've noticed that there's extremism that seems to be captivating
Both
sides.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what we have to acknowledge. Again, if we're just going to be truth tellers, we have to tell the truth that there is extremism on both sides that must be called out for the breaking of laws, for moral relativism, that we've got as Christians. We are not there to be silent towards one and public outcry on the other. We've got to be consistent in our messaging and in our convictions that we are going to call out if we see error, if we see extremism, if we see hate on either side, right or left, we have to call it out for what it is.
Yeah, and I think we kind of go into the next episode in a few moments. That's one of the things I want to call our attention to. What can Christians do right now? Christians can be a voice of moderation. Now, there's a reason that the evangelicals are losing their moral voice and absolutely obliterated it to some extent over the last 4 years. And part of it is because we are combining our politics with our faith at a dangerous level. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But here's what is happening with the extremes is that when a liberal over-responds to conservatives, they become totalitarianists. When a conservative over-responds to liberal positions, they become fascists. And the more fascist that conservatives become, the more totalitarianism erupts.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, and not everybody who's a conservative is going to become a fascist, nor everybody becomes a liberal is going to become a totalitarian. But what we do is we have this element of extremes. Let's say just 20%. Even 20% of 50, when you divide a nation in two, 20% of the 50% on each side is 10% of the total. That's all in the United States. That's 30 million people. That's a lot. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
So we have to understand there's a lot of people that feel very passionately about these things and have now gone from being simple philosophical liberals or conservatives to the point that they become Black Lives Matter and Proud Boys. They become Antifa or fascists.
Yes.
And they have then or QAnon. They've aligned themselves with the most extremes. So what can we as believers do? We can stand up and say, stop, right or left. Let's go back to truth and be voices of moderation.
Yeah.
And I wish we saw some examples, and I didn't see it, of somebody on Capitol Hill last week who was saying, no, stop, don't do this, don't do this.
Right.
And I've seen probably 2 hours, so I've not seen everything, but 2 hours of video. I did not see that, other than the police, Capitol Police trying to maintain some level of order. I didn't see individuals saying, no, stop, come back, pull them off the wall, and so forth. That would have been a great opportunity to have at least put another narrative, another response forward to what became a mob.
Yeah. I think that one of the things that we also have to be careful of is that the opinions of the other group, if you're a conservative or if you're a liberal, that the actions of those few paint the entire group in that one.
Yeah, we want that because it requires little thinking when we can just put everybody into a bad, evil category.
Yes. And I think that's one of those things we have to fight so much against. And I think, again, we only have a few minutes here, but I do believe that one of the greatest problems that Christians have today is the belief, or maybe it's the misplaced hope that everything rises and falls upon the political parties in power. Yeah. And that, to me, I am not saying that it's dangerous what some of the left is doing in silencing conservative. That's dangerous.
Yeah.
Like, there's a part of me that genuinely is concerned about the freedom to speak out against moral issues or any issues that we regard as truth-telling. I have genuine concerns about that based on what has transpired over the last week of silencing different people. But at the same time, my hope, even if they try to silence us, God is so much bigger. And the thing that I keep coming back to is this, because when everything's going on, you're hearing, all these different news sites. I mean, I try to go to New York Times, and I try to go to Daily Wire. Like, I try to go to the right and to the left of the perspectives and the agendas and all those kinds of things. But here's what I've had to do. I've had to say, you know what? I don't know if I know the full truth, but I know who does. And I know that he's going to have to be the one that guides me in truth, because it says the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide us into truth. That to me should be our cry. It should be our heart. It should be, I'm going to fight against the confirmation bias that I'm looking for. And Spirit of God, help me to discern what is happening today. Mm-hmm. Help me to discern the events that have transpired. I don't want to be blind. I don't want to follow man blindly. I don't want to just affirm things that back up my political perspective or my convictions. I want to know how to respond in this moment. And I just think there's been so much of polarization, and we've bought into a narrative that maybe isn't necessarily the true narrative. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I agree. And I think also we have to be willing to listen and consider points of view that we may not agree with. Not necessarily for the idea that I'm going to change my mind, but for the idea that I'm going to show respect. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants to be heard. Everybody needs to be listened to. And in the absence of that, it just increases frustration.
Yeah.
And I think that's why the idea of shutting down voices, limiting free speech, labeling things hate speech, in the end, does not solve anything. It makes it worse.
It does.
Because it doesn't change what you're thinking between your ears. It just changes what you're allowed to say. And that creates a volatile, pent-up resentment.
More extremism.
Yeah, it'll become more extreme. And then we play this tit-for-tat retaliation back and forth that leads nowhere but chaos. So I think as believers, it's very, very important that we take a breath. For instance, I know good and well that there are people who are listening to this podcast right now that you and I have ticked off because they want us to take a stronger position one way or the other. Mm-hmm. There's that, why did you not condemn Donald Trump? Or why do you not believe this election was stolen? And we've addressed neither one of those issues in this episode.
Yeah.
And the fact that we didn't address either one of those episodes or one of those issues is frustrating to some. Mm-hmm. To you who are sitting there and you're a bit angry and you're clenching your steering wheel a little bit, I would just simply say, take a breath. Don't miss what we're trying to say because of what we didn't say. Mm. And you know, do you believe God is sovereign or not? If you believe he is sovereign, take a breath and ask, what is God doing in this situation? Mm. What is he trying to teach me? And what is he trying to do in the grand arc of human history toward his ultimate goal? When you start asking those questions, some of the other issues kind of fade into the background.
And I think even some of the questions we have that might not be answered, the bigger questions that we should be asking are answered. Mm-hmm. And that's good to remember. We've run out of time. We're going to continue this conversation really about how to move forward and how do we avoid splintering the church, and can Christians regain their voice today? I think that's a good question we've got to ask ourselves. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Life Talks, and we hope to talk to you